Less than stories begins. Forget the legends. Here, they are only clinical facts. We are beginning the autopsy of history.
The morning of June 27th, 1876, the little Bighorn Valley had turned into a silent morgue under the ruthless Dakota sun. Movement ceased when the relief columns reached the heights of Custer Hill. The air was heavy, a dense odor of copper, evacuated bowels, and accelerating decay enveloped the surroundings. Not a single gunshot echoed. Only the muffled, mechanical buzzing of carrion flies filled the void. The soldiers dismounted. They began to walk among the scattered white forms. The prairie grass was stained a dark color. Empty shell casings were crushed beneath heavy boots. The bodies had been stripped naked. Limbs were mangled. Rigor mortis had frozen the muscles in bizarre, defensive postures. Arrows protruding from torsos pointed to the sky like dark markers. The soldiers advanced methodically. They searched for faces. They tried to find the chain of command. They sought a forensic logic within the absolute chaos. The temperature was rising. The reality of the massacre was burning into their minds. The faces they found were frozen masks of agony. Most were slashed. Eyes were gouged out. However, as they advanced toward the ridge of the hill, the character of the violence changed. It shifted from battlefield rage to systematic annihilation. The men stopped. Near the summit lay a tight cluster of corpses. Among them was an anomaly, a body completely stripped of its humanity. The soldiers gathered around it. The silence among the living deepened further. The forensic reality on the ground transcended basic comprehension. The object at their feet had no face. The skull was completely crushed. Heavy river stones had been brought down upon this bone structure. Rifle butts had beaten the skull until it surrendered. The kinetic rage applied to this specific cranium was horrifying. The frontal bone had caved in. The eye sockets were pushed into the nasal cavity. The upper and lower jaws were shattered into splinters. The entire architecture of the human head was reduced to a two-dimensional bloody stain. Brain tissue was mixed with dry, alkaline dust. All that remained was a mashed, fleshy crater. This was not the work of a blind bullet. It was not a tomahawk blow swung in the heat of a cavalry charge. This was a clinical intervention. This was a deliberate post-mortem eradication. The enemy had specifically stood over this man's head. They had lifted heavy objects. They had struck downward repeatedly with an inexhaustible, relentless force. They wanted to erase him completely. The destruction went far beyond merely killing the body. It aimed to kill the identity. A man without a face cannot be recognized. He cannot be properly mourned. He simply turns into an empty mound of meat. The attackers had ensured that this officer would never look at the sky again. His military arrogance was buried in the dirt. The physical form was battered until it became unrecognizable. Death was not the end. The primary goal was to condemn the victim to nothingness. The sun was at its zenith. The temperature was approaching 40 degrees. The stench of the flattened corpse was becoming nauseating. The officers of the burial detail stared at this nameless mass. Their minds struggled to process the anatomy. Who was this? The naked, bloated piece of meat offered no answers. There was no uniform, no brass buttons, no insignia of rank. The skin was turning a pale, sickly yellow. Deep cuts crisscrossed the rib cage. The abdominal cavity was disemboweled, yet the crushed head was the focal point of the horror. This condition deprived the soldiers of their most basic human coping mechanism. They could not look into the face of the dead. Without a face, empathy collapses. Disgust takes its place. The soldiers felt a cold dread in their stomachs. This thing was a comrade, a commander. Now it was just an obstacle lying in the dust. Not a single physical feature bearing a sign of life remained. A sergeant stepped forward. His boots kicked up the dry soil. He knelt beside the torso. The corpse's right arm was thrown outward. It rested at an unnatural, broken angle. The limb was covered in a thick crust. Dried blood, sweat, and wind-blown dirt had formed a second skin. The arm now belonged to the earth. The sergeant pulled a rag from his pocket. He didn't speak. No one spoke. He reached out. His fingers touched the stiffened, cold flesh. Rigor mortis held the arm rigid. The sergeant pressed the cloth to the forearm. He began to wipe. The motion was slow, deliberate. The coarse fabric rubbed against the dried crust. Dust fell in fine particles. The dried blood scattered. The sergeant increased the pressure. He scraped away the grime. He was a forensic technician working in a slaughterhouse. The silence was absolute. Only the dry rustle of the cloth rubbing against the skin could be heard. A pale patch of skin emerged. The sergeant focused on this small window of clean flesh. He wiped harder. The crust broke completely. The underlying epidermis was exposed. The skin was dead, cold, and drained of blood. But there was something embedded within it, a color cutting through the monotony of white flesh and brown dirt. Blue, a pale, stubborn blue. The sergeant paused. He cleared the last remnants of dirt with his thumb. The ink was trapped deep within the dermis. It had survived the massacre. It had survived the stripping. It had survived the crushing of the skull. 3 distinct letters became visible. They were sharp, unapologetic. TWC. The letters stared back at the living. A psychological freeze occurred instantly. The soldiers surrounding the body stopped breathing. The air grew heavy as lead. The identification was absolute. The name echoed silently in every mind there. Thomas Ward Custer, the general's younger brother, the man who had won the Medal of Honor twice, the reckless, charismatic, violently aggressive captain, the golden boy of the 7th Cavalry. He was lying at their feet. He was this faceless, crushed pile of bones. The blue ink on the dead skin changed everything. It anchored the horror. This was not a nameless recruit. This was American military aristocracy, and he had been slaughtered with a personal, intimate hatred. The tattoo was the only thing standing between him and absolute anonymity. If the attackers had flayed the skin of his forearm as well, Tom Custer would have been erased from history entirely. He would have been tossed into a mass grave as an unknown soldier. The enemy had smashed his face to destroy him, but they had skipped the arm. The clinical reality of the moment crushed the rescue team. A decorated war hero had been reduced to 3 letters on a rotting piece of meat. His rank meant nothing. His medals meant nothing. His courage meant nothing. The prairie had swallowed his entire identity, save for a few drops of ink. The soldiers looked from the tattoo up to the flattened skull. The contrast was sickening. The pristine clinical clarity of the letters. The chaotic, wet, red ruin of the head. It was a forensic contradiction. The men realized the weight of their discovery. They had found Tom Custer, but they had found the handiwork of a monster. The psychological burden of this knowledge settled on their shoulders. The silence on Custer Hill stretched on. The flies continued to buzz. That pale ink on the dusty skin remained as the sole proof that Thomas Custer had once existed. The erasure was almost perfect. The identification was merely a technical detail. The man was gone. Only the clinical evidence of his annihilation remained. Death on the battlefield is usually pragmatic. A bullet pierces the body, stops the organs, and ends the threat. This is a consequence of the survival instinct, a biological transaction. However, the story told by that specific remain at the summit of Custer Hill was entirely different. The violence applied to Tom Custer's face could not be explained by military necessity. The heat of the battle had long since died down. The heart had stopped. The air in the lungs had emptied. The threat was completely eliminated. Despite this, the attackers standing over the lifeless body continued their actions. This was not an ordinary mark of combat. It was a systematic, targeted, and clinical destruction. The objective was not to end a life. The life had already ended. The objective was the total bankruptcy of identity. Killing a man buries him in history. Physically erasing his face severs him from existence. The enemy warriors deliberately and intentionally targeted the commander's face. This was not a random outburst of rage, it was a calculated session of obliteration, executed with muscle power, gravity, and heavy objects. The face is the center of humanity. The name resides there. The voice that gives commands emerges from between those lips. The arrogant gaze is contained within those eyes. The enemy wanted to wipe that arrogance off the face of the earth. Every blow that landed on the skull was a permanent scratch inflicted upon the American military hierarchy. The heavy river stones ceased to be simple weapons. They transformed into industrial presses, grinding down identity. The cracking of bones, the mashing of flesh, the pulverizing of the brain. This was not a war crime. This was a sculptor working in reverse. The art of destroying form, flattening structure. Tom Custer was an officer who had received the Medal of Honor twice. On his shoulders were the ranks representing the state. On his chest were the medals the system had awarded him. The Dakota and Cheyenne warriors knew very well to whom the flesh beneath those medals belonged. Tom Custer was a symbol. He was the embodiment of ruthlessness, military occupation, and the destructive hubris of the white man. The warriors could not settle for merely cutting off his breath. They had to poison his memory, collapse his ontological existence. Making the body unrecognizable was a post-mortem cancellation of all the ranks the state had bestowed upon him. A faceless body is the absolute antithesis of military honor. War heroes are depicted standing tall and proud in monuments. Their faces look forward to a bright horizon, but a crushed skull can look nowhere. Eye sockets fill with dirt and its own blood. The arched cartilaginous structure of the nose collapses. The jawbone crumbles. All that is left is a wet, shapeless crater. This anatomical state renders honor physically impossible. By reducing Tom Custer to a mass of flesh, the attackers strangled his myth of heroism before it could be born. Stripping him of his uniform was the first step. They removed the state's protection from him. They left him naked. But this was not enough. Individuality had to be destroyed. Individuality is hidden in the face. Shattering the face was a kinetic ritual aimed at erasing the name Tom Custer from the universe. The anatomy of this violence surpasses the psychology of a normal battlefield. Adrenaline allows for the swift killing of a man, but standing over a dead body and repeatedly bringing a heavy stone down upon its head requires an entirely different mental motivation. This is cold-blooded labor. It is spending time. The kinetic energy expended to flatten Custer's face was the mathematical proof of a hatred. Every strike tore away a memory, a piece of identity from the victim. When the stone first descended, the frontal bone broke. On the second strike, the cheekbones pulverized. The third, fourth, and fifth strikes came in rapid succession. What was being hit was no longer a human face. It was merely organic material whose resistance needed to be broken. Flesh, blood, cerebrospinal fluid, and bone dust mixed together. When the destruction was complete, no human remained. There was only a red, bruised stain staring into the void. That face, which the man had possessed the day he was born, was completely taken back through violence. This clinical eradication was a punishment enacted beyond death. Death separates the soul from the body, but erasing the identity turns that body into an absolute nothingness. Tom Custer was no longer an officer. He was merely biological waste subject to the laws of physics and chemistry, a skeletal draft left to rot. Corpses on battlefields generally command a minimal level of respect. Even if it is an enemy, a certain distance is kept from a dead body belonging to the human form. But there was no respect on Custer Hill. Here, there was only an absolute rejection. Tom Custer's existence was rejected. His past, his rank, and his humanity were rejected. That crushed skull baking under the Dakota sun was the most concrete, most clinical evidence of one of the American Army's greatest defeats, locking a soldier inside a prison of his own flesh. condemning him to an eternal anonymity by erasing his face. The human mind is programmed to recognize faces. When a face is looked upon, a soul is seen. The past, emotions, and intentions are read. The absence of a face creates a black hole in the mind. The fact that the dirty skin on his arm had to be scraped to find a tattoo for identification is the proof of this black hole. A man whose face has been erased is exiled from his own history. To the soldiers who found him, he was no longer Captain Tom Custer. He was a damaged object bearing the letters TWC. Facelessness turns a body into an item. It reduces it to a pile of meat, a clinical case, a forensic finding. That is exactly what the enemy aimed for, to transform him from a legend into an object, from a commander into a remnant. The kinetic rage had achieved its purpose. The destruction was flawless. When the warriors touched this body, they did not just break bones, they broke the spine of the mind that occupied the West. Tom Custer's face was the most visible part of that occupation. The desire to conquer was hidden in the lines of that face. They crushed those lines with river stones. They shattered the mouth. The claim of bringing civilization turned into a bloody mud on that dusty hill. The crushing of the skull was a permanent edict carved into the earth by the indigenous people. Ranks held no authority on these lands. Heroics were invalid. Faces would be erased. The message was delivered clearly through the flesh of the victim. Tom Custer was a bloody canvas upon which this message was engraved. He had no face, he had no voice. His identity was bankrupt. He simply lay there as a crushed, rotting mass. In the middle of the battlefield, a body not merely killed, but existentially cancelled. A human being rendered null and void. The topography of Custer Hill was not just a strategic elevation that day. It was also a massive, open-air autopsy table. At the very center of this table, lying only a few paces apart, were two corpses. These two bodies presented one of the most jarring contradictions in battlefield forensics. The chasm between the post-mortem fates of two brothers bound by blood was incomprehensible. On one side lay the legendary commander of the 7th Cavalry, George Armstrong Custer. On the other side was his younger brother, Tom. Both shared the same genetics. Both were killed on the same day, on the same hill, by the same enemy. Yet the difference in the treatment applied to their bodies could not be explained by ordinary battlefield chaos. This anatomical state proved that the violence enacted by the indigenous warriors was not blind rage. There was a highly selective, conscious, and forensic execution mechanism at play. George Custer's body was relatively intact. Death had come to him almost peacefully. There were two clean bullet entry wounds, one in his left chest and one in his left temple. His body had been stripped naked. However, none of his limbs were severed. His face was unmarred. His expression bore the serenity of a sleeping man. His eardrums had been pierced with sharp-tipped arrows. This was a symbolic ritual, performed so that he could hear better in the afterlife. It was a bizarre kind of respect. Because his hair was cut short, he had not been scalped. The great commander lay with surprising wholeness at the epicenter of the savagery. The enemy had not attacked his flesh. They had settled merely for stopping him. The lethal blows were clean, swift, and functional. There was no kinetic waste. George Custer's corpse was the standard biological result of a conventional battle. Just a few meters away lay a clinical disaster. Tom Custer's body was the exact opposite of his older brother's peaceful sleep. He had been reduced to an unidentifiable pile of meat and bone. His skull was utterly crushed. His face had been erased from the physical universe. His rib cage was split open, his abdomen disemboweled. These two entirely different treatments subjected to a man sharing the same genetics defied the random nature of war. For forensic experts, this scene meant only one thing. The target had been singled out. In the midst of the massacre, inside that dust cloud, where arrows and bullets flew Someone had distinguished these two men from each other. The violence had not been distributed randomly. The violence had been directed at a specific target, concentrated, and gathered into a single body. Tom Custer's remains were the focal point of an isolated hatred. The truth behind this forensic contrast rested on a historical irony. The indigenous warriors did not exactly know who they were facing that day. Most did not realize that the legendary long-haired George Custer was at the head of the unit they were attacking. Before setting out on this fatal campaign, George Custer had cut his hair very short. He was not wearing his trademark fringed buckskin jacket. He wore a standard uniform that day. This physical change made him anonymous to the warriors. They did not recognize him, and because they did not recognize him, they did not vomit any special hatred upon him. They viewed him merely as a white man in the line of fire who needed to be dropped. They fired their bullets and moved on. The integrity of the elder Custer's body was a consequence of this absolute anonymity. Being unknown had saved his anatomy. For Tom Custer, however, the situation was completely different. They knew him. They knew his face, his stance, his arrogance, and his cruelty very well. Tom was a much more widely recognized and far more hated figure among the native tribes than his older brother. He had built a reputation for his boundless aggression in past conflicts. In particular, it was he who had arrested the Hunkpapa Lakota warrior, Rain in the Face, in the middle of winter on a murder charge, in an incredibly degrading manner. Tom Custer's military attitude toward the natives always contained a personal humiliation. He was not an ordinary cavalry officer. He was a concrete target from whom personal revenge had to be exacted. When the warriors took the hill and crushed the survivors, they saw this familiar face in the dust. The hatred instantly locked onto a specific coordinate. While his older brother George died like a soldier without being recognized, Tom's unchanged identity became his curse. All that crushed skull, the shattered jawbone, and the disemboweled abdominal cavity were the physical discharge point of a trauma accumulated over years. Among the hundreds of corpses on the battlefield, he received the severest post-mortem punishment. The lion's share of the kinetic energy was spent on this single body. When the warriors stood over Tom, they were not just stopping a man's heart. They were physically settling the score for all past humiliations. Each heavy stone strike was the price of an old wound. Every rifle butt brought down on his skull was the seal of a personal blood feud. The forensic picture proved this indisputably. The enemy had put serious labor into this lifeless body. Tom Custer's corpse was a concrete manifestation of the native tribe's collective memory. In their memory, Tom Custer was a monster. So after death, they made him match the image in their own minds. They turned him into a monster of flesh, a faceless freak. The bodies of the two brothers lying side by side were like a clinical anatomy lesson, illustrating the post-mortem toll of actions. The elder brother, despite the magnitude of his fame, had managed to remain physically intact. The younger brother, under the weight of his own personal actions, had been erased from the physical universe. When the relief troops reached the hill and saw this scene, they could not mentally grasp the situation. Their minds associated the Custer name solely with George. They could not understand why the brother, rather than the legendary commander, had been subjected to such savage destruction. The arrogance of the American military lacked the capacity to decipher the natives' complex name-specific revenge mechanism. For the white man, this was merely savagery, a senseless, barbaric, primitive act of bloodshed. However, the bloody corpses on the ground were the absolute proof of a highly rational and specific forensic execution. This contrast between the intact body of the silent elder brother and the crushed body of the practically screaming younger brother sat at the center of Custer Hill. The evidence at a crime scene does not lie. Tom's corpse was shouting with all its reality. This violence was too personal, too specific, and too focused to be a mere casualty of war. There was a familiarity in the way the bones were broken. There was an acquaintance in the tearing of the flesh. In those final stone strikes that wiped his face completely off the earth, there lay a carefully nurtured reckoning, dating back years. Elder brother Custer was shot as a soldier. Tom Custer was executed as a criminal, and then his body was turned into a public spectacle of warning. Autopsy reports would never be written this way. Official military documents would ignore this forensic truth, standardizing everything under the heading of Indian savagery. But the absolute truth carved into the dry dust and clotted blood on the hill was this: Tom Custer was torn apart because of his known identity. His brother managed to remain whole thanks to his anonymity. The faceless body continued to rot there beside his brother as the ultimate silent monument to a historical fallacy and a personal curse. The sun was now at its zenith. The heat in the Little Bighorn Valley exceeded 40 degrees. This was not a climate. This was an open-air oven. Biological decomposition was advancing at a ferocious pace. Rigor mortis had reached its peak and was beginning to give way to tissue dissolution. The corpses were bloating, skins were stretching from gas pressure. The odor hanging in the air was no longer just a smell that burned the throat. It had a physical weight. Oxygen had been replaced by heavy gases of ammonia and sulfur from rotting human flesh. To breathe was to inhale death into the lungs. The soldiers and the relief troops struggled to remain standing in this toxic atmosphere. Military discipline was crumbling under the biological reality. Orders grew feeble. The men in uniform had entirely detached from the heroic myths of war. The scene before them was not a battlefield. It was an open-air morgue, an unprocessed, unfiltered, absolute slaughterhouse. The arrogance of war was rendered helpless in the face of this biological degradation. Their objective was to identify and bury the remains, but the human brain is not programmed to process this level of destruction. An ordinary soldier is accustomed to seeing blood. A severed limb or a bullet wound is part of a military narrative. These are the acceptable consequences of war. Weapons are fired, bodies fall. This is an equation the mind can rationalize, but the condition of Tom Custer's body completely rejected this narrative. There was no comrade there to mourn. There was no face. The absence of a face was the fundamental forensic factor that pulled the plug on empathy. By looking at a soldier's face, you can imagine his courage, his fear, or his final moments. You can write a story. But looking at a flattened meat crater crushed by stones, no story can be written. There is only nothingness. This nothingness poisons the minds of those who watch. The mind cannot fill that void. The system short circuits. The mental collapse soon turned into a physical reaction. A young private clutched his stomach and fell to his knees. He began to retch. He vomited bile onto the dry alkaline soil. Another followed him, then another. The act of vomiting spread among the burial detail like a contagious disease. This was not a simple nausea starting in the stomach. This was the bodily manifestation of an existential dread. The soldiers were not vomiting out of fear. The fighting was over. They were vomiting from the absolute revulsion of what they saw. They were vomiting from realizing how worthless a human being could suddenly become. That crushed skull shouted in their faces how meaningless all the military arrogance, all the uniforms and the medals were. The entire system they had believed in up to that day had gone bankrupt in the stinking pile of meat at their feet. Their commanders could no longer give them orders, could not protect them, could not encourage them. He was merely biological waste. The earth was about to vomit back out. This was the boundary where human dignity collapsed. Tom Custer was one of the most popular and recognized figures in the American Army. He bore 2 medals of honor on his chest. Those medals were the highest honor a nation could bestow upon a private. It was the certification of heroism, the pinnacle of a flawless military career. Tom Custer was charismatic, aggressive, untouchable. Soldiers respected him, feared him. His name was synonymous with victory, But on that heat-scorched hill, nothing remained of that legend. The medals were gone. The uniform was torn away. The rank was stripped. The soldiers who found him were no longer looking at a captain. They were looking at an object, a rotting, stinking, nameless mass that attracted carrion beetles. The military hierarchy completely collapsed in that moment. The thing lying on the ground was rankless and faceless. You do not salute a faceless body. You do not respect a faceless body. That body is only met with disgust. There is only the desire to get rid of it as soon as possible. Human nature dictates fleeing from this corrupted form. The burial process was not a ritual of honoring. It was a cleanup operation, a mandatory health precaution. There was not enough time, energy, or tools to dig graves. The ground was lethally stony. It had hardened like concrete from the drought. Shovels could not penetrate the earth. Sparks flew with every strike. The soldiers could only dig shallow trenches a few spans deep. This was the extent of the final resting place prepared for Tom Custer. There was no coffin. There was no clean American flag to wrap him in. There was no military band or funeral march. There were only the sounds of soldiers retching, the clatter of shovels striking stone, and the endless monotonous buzzing of flies. The legendary officer had to be placed in this shallow pit, but no one wanted to touch him. To touch was to make direct contact with that crushed reality. It meant smearing those infected fluids on one's hands. It meant physically feeling the facelessness. The body was stiff, but the flesh had begun to soften, to dissolve from within. Its integrity was threatened. The soldiers were forced to grab the corpse by its arms and legs. The skin was slippery. Bodily fluids dripped onto the hot earth. They didn't lift him respectfully and carry him to the grave. They dragged him. The 2-time Medal of Honor hero was dragged through the dust like a sack. This was the absolute 0 point of prestige. The body was shoved toward the pit. It slid. It hit the bottom hard. Because he had no face, it didn't matter which way his head was turned. He was not looking at the sky. He was looking nowhere. His gaze had been destroyed. He was merely an organic volume, filling a shallow hole. The first shovelful of dirt thrown over him filled the wet crater of his crushed skull. Mud and clotted blood mixed together. The soldiers moved extremely fast. They averted their eyes deliberately. They just wanted to finish this job and get away, to escape that stench. The shoveling process took seconds. The shallow grave filled quickly. A few heavy river stones were dropped on top. These stones were not a monument to heroism. They were merely pragmatic, desperate obstacles placed to prevent wild animals and coyotes from digging the body up at night. The ceremony was over. No prayer was read. No one spoke bright, patriotic words for the legendary commander. Besides, there was no face to listen to them. Everyone was trying to suppress the horror in their own minds. Tom Custer, his identity erased, his face destroyed, was hastily buried on that hill. This was not a simple burial process. It was the total rejection of identity. It was the ultimate jarring proof that the system could not protect him, that his rank could not save him. That shallow grave was the place where not only a man, but also the invincibility, hubris of the American army was buried. The soldiers gathered their shovels. They did not look back. What they left behind was not a commander's resting place. It was a hastily covered shame. It was the physical, foul-smelling proof of a defeat. The only thing echoing in their minds was the image of that crushed head and the pale blue ink on the arm. That hill was no longer a sacred ground where they had heroically buried their commanders. It was a forensic dump where they vomited their own fears, revulsions, and mental collapses into the earth, and hastily hid a nameless pile of meat. Tom Custer's body, stripped of all the identities the system had given him, was left to melt into an endless nothingness. The only thing far heavier than death was the cancellation of his existence in such a definitive, absolute, and repulsive manner. A faceless man would not rot beneath the earth. He would simply cease to exist. and the men who buried him there would spend the rest of their lives carrying the weight of the black hole created by that crushed skull. The physical corpse had been left to rot underground, but information was rapidly traveling eastward. Telegraph wires carried the horror of Custer Hill to Washington, New York, and Boston. When the Army High Command read the initial forensic reports from the Little Bighorn, they faced a colossal crisis. The reports contained much more than a military defeat. The systematic mutilation of the soldiers, the flattening of the command staff's faces by crushing them with stones, was a clinical blow struck against the American state's aura of invincibility. In particular, the condition of Thomas Custer's body was an unrationalizable terror for the commanders. A state cannot tell its people that its heroes were reduced to nameless piles of meat with river stones. It cannot explain that an officer bearing 2 medals of honor was reduced to relying on a faint tattoo on a dusty arm to prove his identity. This reality does not breed patriotism. This reality only creates absolute terror, profound distrust of the army, and a paralyzing aversion to war. Mass psychology cannot endure this level of biological degradation. The truth was toxic material that served the state no purpose and would paralyze the masses. This poison had to be neutralized immediately. The censorship mechanism swiftly kicked in to cover up the forensic reality. The military's official records sterilized the autopsy table of Custer Hill. Crushed skulls, disemboweled abdomens, and faceless bodies were carefully scrubbed from the reports. The nature of the war was rewritten on paper. The American public had to be convinced of the idea of entirely conquering the West. For this they needed not a forensic disaster, but a mythology of martyrdom. Tom Custer's pathetic, identityless state in that shallow pit urgently needed to be transformed into a heroic tragedy. The joint engineering of the state and the media began precisely at this point. Clinical reality was replaced by a manufactured fantasy of savagery. The true savagery was the enemy reducing Tom Custer to nothingness, crushing his ontological existence. The manufactured savagery, however, was the enemy destroying him like a mythological hero. The difference between the two was the key to managing mass psychology and dragging a nation into all-out war. Within weeks, newspaper headlines launched a new and flawless lie into the market. This lie was built directly upon Tom Custer's body. According to the story, the Hunkpapa Lakota warrior, Rain in the Face, had found Tom on the battlefield to exact revenge for his past arrest. But in the story told by the media, the warrior had not crushed Tom's head. The newspapers wrote that the native warrior had cut open Tom Custer's chest while he was alive, ripped out his beating heart, and ate it. This was one of the most successful and bloodiest manipulations in the history of journalism. The ritual of ripping out and eating a heart was stolen straight from primitive warrior mythology, from a dark, pagan fantasy. This lie perfectly catered to the savage native prejudices of the American public. Society perceived the eating of a man's heart as horrifying but understandable hostility. This constructed a carefully designed propaganda that proved not the superiority of the warriors, but what animals they were, so far removed from civilization. In truth, the physical reality was much colder, much more clinical, and much more degrading. Tom Custer's heart had not been ripped out. His heart still lay inside his shattered rib cage, rotting along with his body in that shallow pit. The enemy had not cared about his heart, because the heart is the metaphor of courage. The enemy was interested in his mind, his arrogance, and his identity. That is why they crushed his head, not his heart. They erased his face from the physical universe. They turned him not into an honored warrior, but into an anonymous nothingness. The heart-ripping lie was actually a post-mortem restoration of honor bestowed upon Tom Custer by the hands of the American state. To rip out and eat someone's heart requires believing that there is immense power and courage within that heart. This is a perverse, archaic respect for the victim. A crushed skull, on the other hand, is merely the result of seeing the victim as an insect that needs to be squashed, of absolute devaluation. The state chose the story of a lion with a ripped out heart over the story of a squashed insect. The masses will volunteer to avenge the lion. No one takes up arms to avenge a mere insect. That small blue tattoo on his arm represented the only truth in the universe. The letters TWC were a clinical reference point measuring the magnitude of the violence the body endured, but the state's reference point was not anatomical facts, but political needs. The propaganda machine worked at full capacity. The myth of the heroic brother whose heart was ripped out provided the American army with the colossal war motivation it needed. The revenge for Custer Hill was exacted with the high-octane fuel of this manufactured lie. One of the most ruthless, most systematic military campaigns in history was launched against the native tribes. Thousands of people were slaughtered, driven from their lands, and imprisoned in reservations for the sake of avenging a heart that had never actually been ripped out. Reality was completely drowned under the black ink of newspapers and the brass bands of the army. The clinical findings of the Little Bighorn were locked away on the dusty, inaccessible shelves of military archives. Tom Custer's body was never again discussed with scientific honesty, with forensic neutrality. His facelessness was made a top-secret state matter. His anonymity was covered up with the heroic epics of cheap dime novels and stage plays. The silent testimony of those first relief columns that cleaned up the crime scene was ruthlessly swallowed by the system. The freezing heat the soldiers vomited in, the throat-burning stench of rotting flesh, and the blue tattoo found by wiping the dirty skin on the arm were forever scraped from collective memory. The honest forensic report of the battlefield was swapped with the ideological report of nation building. How Tom Custer actually died, what was done to his skull after his death, and how he was shoved into a pit as a pile of meat was never revealed to the public. Minds were numbed with manufactured mythology. The truth, however, was left to rot in that shallow, stinking pit. The state had colonized not only the lands of the West, but also death itself and post-mortem reality. The corpse of a man, with its consent and physical state entirely ignored, was turned into the false banner of a massive military campaign. Legends grew. Bronze monuments were erected. History books rewrote what happened on that hill that day in epic language. But the universe of physics and biological evidence do not lie. What lay beneath the earth was not an epic. It was not a hero. He was merely a forensic victim who had been the target of kinetic rage, completely stripped of human dignity. A piece of flesh whose identity was bankrupted and whose anatomy was flattened with river stones. His skull had turned into a crater. His face had been wiped off the earth. He died in his brother's shadow and drowned in the specific hatred of his own enemies. If not for the faint ink on a piece of dried dead skin, there would have been no physiological proof that he once existed. The American state immortalized his name. The media turned his death into a useful mythology. However, historical reality froze in the clinical, relentless silence of Custer Hill. Thomas Ward Custer was forever trapped, not in that grand epic told by the state, but as a faceless and crushed body within the dark, silent, and foul-smelling pit of his own anonymity. The truth was utterly crushed. The lie had occupied the entire continent.
The investigation is complete. Facts have been laid on the table. Last stand stories concludes for now. The file is closed.